A cleaning lady helped a stranger, but discover he was her new billionaire boss. The night was cold, damp, and relentless. The lights of New York flickered like artificial stars over the city, reflecting in the rain puddles scattered across the asphalt. Emily Carter pulled up the frayed hood of her coat, feeling the icy wind cut through her skin. It was yet another lonely early morning after an exhausting shift as a janitor in one of the city's most luxurious skyscrapers. Her hands, dry and rough from cleaning chemicals, trembled slightly as she adjusted the strap of her bag on her shoulder. She just wanted to get home and see Lily, her 5-year-old daughter, sleeping peacefully. Her footsteps echoed against the wet pavement when a low, muffled groan sliced through the silence of the nearly deserted street. Her heart pounded. Emily glanced around, hesitant, ready to ignore it and move on. New York wasn't a safe place to get involved in other people's problems. But then she saw him, a man, slumped against the wall of a dark alley, struggling to breathe. Before continuing, make sure to subscribe to the channel so we can reach our goal of 1,000 subscribers. He was sitting on the ground, his dress shirt soaked with water and blood. His face was partially obscured by the shadows, but Emily could make out a deep gash on his forehead and a bruise beginning to form along his jawline. Her instincts told her to walk away. Her rational mind insisted she shouldn't get involved. But something in the way he fought to stay conscious, in his labored breathing, in the way he tried to mask his pain, made something inside her hesitate. "Sir?" Her voice came out weaker than she intended. The man lifted his gaze, and for a brief moment, a chill ran down Emily's spine. There was something there, in those dark eyes, something too intense, too powerful. He tried to stand, but his legs gave out. Without thinking, Emily knelt beside him, gripping his shoulder to keep him from collapsing. The soaked fabric of his shirt was sticky with blood, and she swallowed hard. "You need help." The man let out a short, ragged laugh, more like a painful exhale. "I'm fine." Emily raised an eyebrow. "Right? Because everyone just spends the night bleeding in an alley like it's the most normal thing in the world." He averted his gaze, as if weighing whether he could trust her. When he looked back at her, his expression held a mixture of exhaustion and surrender. "I just need a minute." Emily bit her lower lip. She wasn't a hero, wasn't someone who could afford to get tangled up with an injured stranger. But her conscience screamed at her that if she walked away now, he might not survive. "Do you have someone to call? A phone?" He shook his head slowly. "It was taken." Emily sighed. She knew nothing about this man, but her intuition told her he wasn't just some random vagrant or a street criminal. He seemed out of place, like he didn't belong in this world. "Okay," she said firmly. "Come with me." He blinked, surprised. "What?" "You need to clean that cut before it gets infected." She gestured toward his forehead. "I know a place nearby where you can rest for a bit." The man hesitated. Emily could tell he was trying to decide whether he could trust her. When he finally gave a small nod, she slipped his arm over her shoulder and helped him to his feet. He was tall and strong, but far too weak to stand on his own. She held him steady and started walking with him through the dark streets. What she didn't know was that this encounter would change her life forever. At the end of the street, a small, unassuming diner stood beneath a flickering neon sign that read, 24-hour cafe. The scent of freshly brewed coffee and sizzling bacon filled the air, blending with the slightly sweet aroma of pies displayed behind the glass counter. Emily helped the man settle into a booth in the back, away from the curious glances of two drowsy customers and the server lazily wiping down the counter. She slid into the seat across from him, watching as he ran a hand through his dark, disheveled hair, inhaling deeply, as if trying to steady himself. His dress shirt, now mostly dry, bore darkened stains of dried blood on the expensive fabric. His jacket had been left behind in the alley, and despite his injuries and exhaustion, Emily couldn't ignore the natural authority he carried. He wasn't just some random guy. "You should go to a hospital," she said, breaking the silence. He lifted his eyes to hers, and something in his expression sent a shiver down her spine. It was as if he carried an invisible weight on his shoulders. "I can't." "Why not?" He hesitated. "I just can't." Emily crossed her arms. "Right? Then at least let me clean that cut before it gets infected." He let out a tired sigh but didn't protest when she grabbed a few napkins from the table and asked the server for a bottle of water. When she returned, she soaked the paper in the liquid and gently began wiping away the dried blood from his forehead. He didn't complain, but his jaw tightened as the napkin pressed against the open wound. "Do you always rescue strangers in alleys?" he asked with a faint, exhausted smile. Emily chuckled, shaking her head. "No, but you looked like you needed help." "What if I was dangerous?" "Well," she tilted her head, pretending to think. "You're pretty banged up and can barely stand. I could probably take you down if I had to." He let out a quiet laugh, but Emily noticed it faded quickly, replaced by something darker in his expression. "Thanks," he said after a moment. "You don't have to thank me." Silence settled between them. The man stared at the table, lost in distant thoughts. Emily could feel his hesitation, the internal struggle evident in the way his fingers lightly traced patterns on the tabletop. "What's your name?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment, as if deciding whether he should answer. "Daniel." She waited for a last name, but he didn't offer one. "Okay, Daniel. Do you want to tell me what happened to you?" He slowly shook his head. "It's complicated." Emily raised an eyebrow. "Were you attacked?" "Something like that." She narrowed her eyes. "Something like that" isn't a very convincing answer. Daniel lifted his gaze to hers, and for a moment, it seemed like he was about to say something. But then his eyes shifted toward the diner's entrance, as if he feared someone might walk in at any moment. Emily noticed his unease. Something was off. He wasn't just an injured man. There was a mystery behind this stranger, a secret he wasn't willing to share. "Do you need a taxi somewhere?" she asked. He hesitated before shaking his head. "No, I'll handle it." Emily didn't press. There was something in the way he spoke, in the careful way he chose his words, that made her realize that even in his injured state, Daniel was a man used to being in control. She didn't know who he was. She didn't know where he came from or what had happened to him. But one thing was certain. He wasn't just some lost stranger wandering the city. And Emily had no idea how much this night was about to change her life forever. The next morning, Emily woke up before sunrise, as she always did. The alarm hadn't gone off yet, but the weight of routine and the need to provide for her daughter pulled her out of sleep early. She rose carefully, not wanting to wake Lily, who was curled up, hugging the old teddy bear Emily had patched up countless times. The events of the previous night still echoed in her mind. The mysterious man, Daniel, his guarded expression, the way he seemed to be running from something. It all kept replaying in her head, but Emily couldn't afford to dwell on it. Her reality was simple and unforgiving. Another long shift cleaning offices at the company where she worked. She slipped into her blue uniform and stepped out to face the day. The skyscraper where she worked was one of the most luxurious in New York, home to executives, investors, and powerful business figures. Emily was just one of the many invisible workers who kept the place running, unnoticed by those who walked its pristine hallways. As soon as she entered the building, she sensed something was different. There was a buzz in the air. The security guards were more alert. The managers whispered in hushed tones, and people glanced anxiously toward the top floor with a mix of curiosity and tension. "Have you heard?" One of the other janitors, Marta, approached her in a whisper. "Heard what?" "The new CEO is arriving today." Emily blinked, confused. "New CEO?" "Yeah." Marta lowered her voice, glancing around. Apparently, there was a sudden change in the company's leadership. Word is, the heir finally came back to take over the family business. Emily shook her head, not giving it much thought. That world of billionaires and executives had nothing to do with her reality. Her job was to clean, not worry about who was signing the checks. She went about her routine, scrubbing hallways and conference rooms. But the atmosphere was different. The building felt charged, as if something big was about to happen. Then she heard it, the distinct chime of the executive elevator descending from the top floor. The doors slid open, and a group of men in perfectly tailored suits stepped out, their movements crisp and purposeful. At the center of them was a figure that made Emily's heart lurch. It was Daniel. She froze. The cleaning rag slipped from her fingers, landing on the polished floor with a soft thud. Couldn't be, but it was. This time he wasn't injured. He wasn't disoriented. He was impeccable. The tailored suit molded perfectly to his broad shoulders. His face was clean, not a single trace of blood or pain. He walked with confidence, his expression cold and calculated, as if the man she had helped the night before had never existed. Daniel Sterling. The name rang in her mind. Daniel Sterling, the billionaire heir, the man who was now her boss. His gaze swept across the room, and for a fleeting second, his eyes met hers. Emily's stomach twisted. There was recognition there, a flicker of surprise. But the next second, he masked it. He kept walking as if she didn't exist. Emily stood frozen, her heart pounding violently in her chest. She didn't know what scared her more: the fact that she had unknowingly helped a billionaire last night, or the certainty that her life would never be the same after this. Emily felt her breath falter. The man she had helped the night before, the bloodied, vulnerable stranger who had refused to go to a hospital, was now walking with the commanding presence of a true magnate. Daniel Sterling. The name was familiar, but only distantly, like one of those figures who occasionally appeared in headlines about reclusive billionaires. And now he was here, just a few feet away. His gaze had brushed over her for the briefest second before he continued walking as if nothing had happened. She forced herself to move, quickly bending down to pick up the fallen rag, as if the simple act could mask the turmoil in her expression. Her fingers trembled slightly. Her chest felt like a storm of scattered thoughts. "Emily, did you see that?" Marta whispered beside her, wide-eyed. "My God, he's younger than I imagined. And look at him. He radiates power, doesn't he?" Emily couldn't answer. Her mouth had gone dry. The new CEO and his entourage of executives strode down the hallway, the sound of their expensive shoes echoing against the polished floor. Everything around them seemed to quiet. Employees pressed themselves against the walls, watching their new boss arrive with a mix of respect and, in some cases, outright fear. A chill ran down Emily's spine. Would he pretend not to know her? She forced herself to keep cleaning, willing herself to ignore the chaos in her mind. But deep down, she knew she wouldn't be able to hide forever. Time seemed to slow as she finished the corridor. Then, her worst fear was confirmed when she heard the head of operations, Mr. Hawkins, call her name. Emily Carter. Her entire body tensed. Marta shot her a worried look, as if already sensing that nothing good would come from such a direct summons. Emily turned slowly, trying to keep her composure. "Yes, sir?" The man studied her for a moment, as if confirming something. "Mr. Sterling has requested you to report to his office at the end of your shift." Emily blinked. Her heart leapt in her chest. "What? You heard me. Be on time." Her throat tightened. "What? Why? What did he want with her? Was he going to thank her? Fire her?" Emily wanted to ask, but Hawkins was already gone, busy tending to the demands of the new leadership. Anxiety surged through her like an unstoppable wave. She needed to work to keep her head down, but how was she supposed to do that, knowing that the man she had helped, who was now her billionaire boss, wanted to see her in his office? Nothing about this morning made sense. And somehow, she had the feeling this was only the beginning. Emily spent the rest of the day trying to focus on her work, but it was impossible. The request to report to Daniel Sterling's office pounded in her mind like a ticking clock. Every time she glanced at the wall clock, the tension in her chest tightened. Why did he want to see her? The minutes dragged on, and she caught herself wiping down the same surface twice without realizing it. Her heart wouldn't settle. The memories of the previous night haunted her. The blood on his shirt, the dark weight in his eyes, his hesitation to reveal who he truly was. But now, here, inside the building where he ruled, Daniel Sterling seemed like an entirely different person. Distant, untouchable. When her shift finally ended, Emily put away her supplies and instinctively smoothed her uniform. "Don't be ridiculous," she scolded herself. "He probably just wants to thank me and move on with his life." But deep down, something told her it wasn't that simple. With measured steps, she crossed the lobby, taking the elevator to the executive floor. This was an entirely different world. Luxurious carpets, floor-to-ceiling glass walls reflecting the golden hues of the sunset, the muted sound of expensive shoes gliding across polished floors. Emily felt out of place, as if she had stepped into a reality she didn't belong in. The CEO's secretary, an impeccably dressed woman named Charlotte, eyed her up and down, her expression neutral but her gaze assessing every detail. "Emily Carter?" She nodded. "Mr. Sterling is expecting you. You may go in." Emily swallowed hard and pushed open the heavy wooden door. The office was vast and minimalist, with glass walls offering a breathtaking view of the city skyline. Daniel stood there, his back to her, staring out at the horizon as if lost in thought. His tailored suit molded perfectly to his broad shoulders, his hands tucked into his trouser pockets. When he turned around, Emily held her breath. That look, it wasn't the same look from the night before, vulnerable and beaten down. Now his eyes held something deeper, something indecipherable. "Close the door," he said, his voice low but firm. Emily hesitated for a second before obeying. Silence settled between them. "Are you okay?" Daniel asked. She blinked, caught off guard. "Me? I should be the one asking you that." The corner of his mouth lifted slightly, but there was no humor in the gesture. "I imagine it was a shock seeing me here today." Emily let out a short, nervous laugh. "That's an understatement." Daniel ran a hand through his hair, an almost unconscious gesture, then took a few steps closer. "About last night," he started but stopped, as if carefully choosing his words. Emily crossed her arms. "I'm not going to ask what happened to you, but if you called me here just to say thank you, you don't need to. I only did what any decent person would have done." His eyes narrowed slightly. "Do you really think just anyone would have done what you did?" Emily hesitated. I don't know. "I do," he said with certainty. "Most people would have walked right past me. You didn't." She looked away, feeling an odd warmth spread in her chest. She didn't know how to respond to that. "But I didn't call you here just to thank you, Emily." The way he said her name made something inside her twist. "Then why did you call me here?" Daniel studied her for a moment, and Emily felt as if his gaze could see right through her. "Because you helped me without knowing who I am, and that made me want to know more about you." Emily's heart pounded. This conversation was taking a turn she hadn't expected. And at that moment, she realized her life was about to change forever. Daniel's office felt too big, too sophisticated for someone like Emily. She felt out of place, as if she had crossed some invisible boundary between two worlds that were never meant to intersect. Yet here she was, standing before a man who, just last night, had been a wounded stranger in an alley. Now, he was the billionaire CEO of one of the most powerful companies in New York. The revelation still swirled inside her, like a storm threatening to tear apart what little balance remained in her mind. "Know more about me?" Emily broke the silence, crossing her arms, trying to keep herself steady. "I'm just a janitor, Daniel. There's nothing interesting to know." He tilted his head slightly, studying her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Don't say that." His voice was calm, but there was weight behind his words. "The people we overlook often have the most fascinating stories." A shiver ran down Emily's spine. His gaze was too intense, like he was trying to decode her from the inside out. But she didn't want to be read. She didn't want a man like him to see beyond the surface. "So you called me here just out of curiosity?" Her voice carried a hint of disbelief. Daniel let out a quiet sigh, running a hand over his jaw before stepping toward his desk, planting both hands on the sleek glass surface. "I called you here because I want to make you an offer." Emily's brows knitted together. "An offer?" "Yes." She let out a nervous laugh, crossing her arms even tighter. "If this is some kind of thank you check, forget it. I don't want your money." Daniel raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by her quick and firm response. "It's not money, Emily. It's an opportunity." She hesitated, her heart pounding against her ribs. "An opportunity?" Daniel took a deep breath, as if organizing his thoughts before speaking. "I want to offer you a better position within the company, something that gets you out of the cleaning department." The shock hit Emily like a cold wave. "What? An administrative job? Or any other area that interests you? Something with better pay, benefits? Something that—" He paused for a second. "Something that gives you a better future." Emily blinked, unable to believe what she was hearing. "You want to promote me?" "Yes." She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Why?" "Because you deserve something better." A knot formed in her throat. It was hard to explain the storm brewing inside her. On one hand, the idea of leaving janitorial work for a better job felt like an impossible dream. But on the other, why would a man like him do this? She clenched her fists. "I don't need your charity." Daniel met her gaze, unwavering. "It's not charity. It's recognition." Emily looked away, her emotions colliding inside her. "I've learned not to trust gifts that come out of nowhere, Daniel. In real life, no one gives anything without expecting something in return." He seemed to consider that for a moment before responding. "I don't expect anything from you. I just want you to think about the possibility." She bit her lower lip, her mind spinning in 1,000 different directions. "I don't know what to say." Daniel gave a small smile. "You don't have to say anything right now. Just think about it." Emily felt her breath falter. For some reason, she knew this wouldn't end here. And whether she liked it or not, a part of her already felt that Daniel Sterling was changing her life. Emily left Daniel's office with her head spinning. Her heart pounded, her breaths were shallow, and a million questions hammered inside her mind. Why was he doing this? Why would Daniel Sterling, a billionaire used to power, care about changing the life of a janitor? She walked through the halls of the executive floor feeling out of place, like she had stepped into a world that wasn't meant for her. The elevator ride down to the lobby felt agonizingly slow. And when the doors finally opened, she rushed out, desperate to escape that building. Outside, the cold New York wind hit her face, but the fresh air wasn't enough to clear her mind. As she walked toward the subway, she kept asking herself, should she accept the offer? Was it a mistake? A trap? The last thing Emily wanted was to become a charity case for a powerful man who, in the end, might get bored of her and discard her, just like so many disposable things in the world of the rich. When she finally arrived at her tiny apartment, she found Lily playing with her teddy bear on the couch. Mrs. Hopkins, the elderly babysitter, was already gathering her things to leave. She was good today, the woman said with a warm smile. Emily smiled back, but her mind was still elsewhere. After putting Lily to bed, Emily sat at the kitchen table, staring at the bills scattered in front of her. The rent was overdue, the electricity bill too. Her salary as a janitor barely covered the basics. Promotion would mean stability. It would mean a better life for her daughter. But at the same time, something inside her hesitated. Daniel was a mystery. The night she found him, he seemed like just another man in danger. Now, he was a powerful CEO offering her a chance to change her life, without asking for anything in return. It didn't make sense. Over the next few days, Emily tried to stay off Daniel's radar, focusing on her work and avoiding the upper floors of the building. But no matter how much she tried to disappear, he always seemed to be around. She saw him crossing the lobby a few times, surrounded by security and executives. But what unsettled her the most were the moments when he seemed to be looking for her. One afternoon, while Emily was cleaning the glass windows near the main entrance, she felt a gaze burning into her back. When she turned around, she found Daniel standing just a few feet away, watching her. He was on the phone, but his eyes were locked on her. For a second, a strange shiver ran down her spine. Another time, while tidying up a conference room, the door swung open, and he walked in, not realizing she was there. Their eyes met, and for a few seconds that felt like an eternity, the silence between them was suffocating. Emily was the first to look away and leave quickly. With every encounter, her unease grew. She wanted to distance herself, wanted to pretend none of this had ever happened. But the truth was, there was something about him. Something that had stirred in her from the moment she found him injured. And it wasn't just the fact that he was a billionaire. It was something else. Something she couldn't explain. But trusting a man like Daniel Sterling could be a mistake. A mistake she might never recover from. And Emily wasn't ready to break again. The days dragged on, but Emily couldn't shake Daniel from her mind. What started as a simple act of kindness had turned into a storm of confusing emotions. She tried convincing herself that he was just another billionaire boss, living in a world that would never intersect with hers again. But Daniel seemed determined to prove her wrong. That night, after another exhausting shift, Emily stepped out of the building, her body heavy with fatigue. The cold New York wind made her thin uniform feel like paper. She pulled her worn-out coat tighter and started toward the subway, longing to go home. Emily. Daniel's deep, unmistakable voice made her stop instantly. Her heart leapt inside her chest. He was there. She turned slowly, finding him leaning against a sleek black SUV parked by the curb. Unlike the impeccably dressed man she was used to seeing inside the company, tonight he wore a dark overcoat, his hands tucked into his pockets. His intense gaze was locked onto hers. "What are you doing here?" she asked, frowning. Daniel tilted his head slightly. "I could ask you the same thing." She let out a tired sigh. "I'm going home, Daniel. Unlike some people, I actually need to sleep." He gave a slight smirk, but there was something in the way he looked at her that made her stomach tighten. "Have dinner with me." Emily blinked, confused. What? Dinner? Food? Conversation? No hidden motives? He said, raising his hands as if to prove he had no ulterior motives. "I just want to get to know you better." She let out a laugh, shaking her head in disbelief. "You're unbelievable. I hear that a lot. Daniel, this is a terrible idea." "Why?" Emily crossed her arms, feeling the chill in the air against her skin. "Because I'm just a janitor, and you're my boss. Because there are already too many people in that company giving me strange looks after what happened in your office. And because," she hesitated before adding, in a quieter tone, "because I don't trust you." Daniel seemed to take in her words. For a moment, Emily thought he might give up, that he'd turn around and get into his car without looking back. But instead, he stepped forward, closing the distance between them. "I understand," he said, his voice firm but without arrogance. "But maybe you should give me a chance to change that." Emily held her breath. The proximity, the woody scent of his cologne, the way his dark eyes seemed to read everything she was trying to hide. She was treading dangerous ground. "Let me take you to dinner," he insisted. "Just one dinner. If you don't like it, I'll never ask again." Emily looked down, trying to ignore the part of herself that was screaming at her to say yes. But at the same time, this was the first time in a long time that someone seemed genuinely interested in her. Not out of obligation, not out of pity, but because he wanted to. Against all her defenses, against every warning sign flashing in her mind, she heard herself say, "1 hour, and no fancy places." Daniel's smile widened. "I know the perfect place." Emily had no idea what she was getting herself into. But for the first time in years, she was willing to find out. Emily's heart pounded as she stepped into Daniel's car. The soft leather seat, the woodsy scent of his cologne, the way he drove so calmly through the streets of New York. It all felt like a world so distant from hers, almost surreal. The silence between them wasn't awkward, but it was thick with an invisible tension. Emily kept her gaze on the window, watching the city lights flicker in the distance, trying to ignore the fact that she was in a billionaire's car, a man who had somehow inexplicably crossed into her life. They pulled up to a quiet, unassuming restaurant, no flashy signs, no long lines. The kind of place that didn't attract the city's elite, but had a warm, inviting charm. The atmosphere was softly lit, the tables rustic, dark wood. Emily relaxed a little. At least he had kept his promise to avoid anything too extravagant. They took a quiet corner table. Daniel ordered 2 coffees and waited patiently as Emily traced her fingers along the rim of her cup, unsure how to break the silence. "You're tense," he noted with no pretense. She let out a low laugh, but there was no humor in it. "You kidnapped me for dinner. What did you expect?" Daniel smirked slightly, but his eyes remained serious. "I didn't force anything. You wanted to be here." Emily opened her mouth to argue, but she couldn't. He was right. She had wanted to be here. The silence stretched between them until Daniel leaned forward, resting his arms on the table. "You asked me what happened the night you found me," he said. "I think I owe you that answer." Emily lifted her gaze to him, her stomach tightening. "You don't have to." "I do." She swallowed hard and waited. Daniel took a deep breath before continuing. "My father owned half this city. Banks, real estate, investments. He built an empire and expected me to take over without question. But I was never the perfect son he wanted." Emily stayed quiet, watching his face, the shadows in his eyes, the weight in his words that felt deeper than just resentment. "I lived my life my own way, made choices he didn't approve of. Then, a year ago, my father died and left me everything. But along with that inheritance came a whole lot of dirt he tried to keep buried." A chill ran down Emily's spine. "Dirt?" Daniel nodded. "He made a lot of enemies, and some of them were still inside the company when I took over. They tried to push me out, manipulate me, make me sign contracts that would put power in the hands of people who never should have had it. But I started digging, finding the right connections. That's when they realized I knew too much." Emily held her breath. "You were attacked. Because of that?" Daniel's eyes darkened, a cold glint flashing in them. "They tried to get me out of the way. They followed me that night, cornered me. The hit to my head wasn't an accident. It was a warning." Emily felt a knot form in her throat. "My God!" Daniel let out a tired sigh, his gaze dropping to the coffee in front of him, as if reliving it all over again. "If it weren't for you, I might not have pulled myself together in time." She swallowed hard, a mix of fear and indignation swirling inside her. "Did you report this to the police?" He let out a humorless laugh. "This isn't something the police can fix. The problem runs deeper than you think." Emily's head spun. She wanted to believe this was a world far away from hers, that things like this only happened in movies or in the news. But now she was here, sitting across from a man who carried invisible scars from a dangerous game she barely understood. "I shouldn't be involved in this." Her voice came out quieter than she intended. Daniel studied her for a moment before saying, calmly, "I would never put you in danger, Emily." She wanted to believe him, but something inside her whispered that it was already too late. The ride back was silent. Emily kept her gaze fixed on the city rushing past the window, trying to process everything Daniel had told her. Her heart still pounded. He had been attacked. Someone wanted to silence him, and somehow she was caught in the middle of it. The car glided smoothly through the streets of New York before pulling up in front of Emily's building. She hesitated for a second before unbuckling her seatbelt. "Thanks for dinner," she said, her voice steadier than she actually felt. Daniel watched her, his dark eyes analyzing every small reaction. "You're scared." "I'm not scared," she lied, trying to ignore the feeling that something much bigger than she could control was unfolding around her. Daniel frowned, as if he could see right through her facade. "Emily, I know this is a lot to take in. I never expected you to hear all of this and just accept it." Her hand gripped the door handle, but she didn't get out. "It's not just that," she admitted, feeling a knot tighten in her throat. "I don't belong in this world, Daniel. I clean the hallways of that company. People like you don't show up in my life." He tilted his head slightly. "People like me?" Emily sighed, exhaustion weighing on her. "Rich, powerful, untouchable. You don't understand what it's like to count every penny just to pay rent. You've never had to choose between buying food or paying a bill. Whatever this is, whatever you think you feel, it doesn't make sense." Daniel was silent for a moment, but his gaze stayed firm. "You think I'm untouchable?" His voice was low, almost challenging. "You saw me that night, Emily, bleeding, vulnerable, alone. Does that seem untouchable to you?" She closed her eyes for a brief moment, trying to ignore the truth in his words. "That doesn't change the fact that we come from different worlds." "Then explain something to me," he pressed. "Why can't I just forget about you?" Emily's breath hitched. The truth was, she couldn't forget him either. Since that night, Daniel had been in her mind. In every thought, in every doubt. But she couldn't admit it, because admitting it meant allowing herself to feel. And allowing herself to feel meant risking getting hurt. She pushed the door open and stepped out without looking back. "Good night, Daniel." The car door clicked shut behind her. But even after stepping into her apartment and collapsing onto her bed, Emily knew. She was already involved. And there was no way out. The next morning, everything fell apart. Emily arrived at the building exhausted but determined to bury everything deep in her mind. She needed to work. She needed to pretend nothing had changed. But the whispers in the hallways were impossible to ignore. "Did you hear? My God. Does she really think she can mess around with him? What do you think she did to get the boss's attention?" Emily froze in the middle of the corridor, feeling the weight of the stairs pressing into her back. They were talking about her. Her stomach twisted. She kept walking, her pace firm, until she reached the janitor's storage room and leaned against the wall, trying to steady her breathing. Someone had found out. The dinner, the conversation, the fact that she had been in Daniel's office. And now she was a target. Emily felt a crushing tightness in her chest. This was what she had feared. Daniel's world was a place where she would never be accepted. And now it seemed like that world was about to swallow her whole. She felt the burn of judgmental stares as she walked through the halls. The whispers never stopped, a constant buzz of insinuations and rumors that made her feel suffocated. What had they found out? Who had spread it? The worst part was, she knew exactly how these stories spread. Just being seen in Daniel's office, or worse, going out to dinner with him, was enough to turn her life into a nightmare. She wasn't one of them. She didn't belong in the circle of people who could bump into a billionaire and magically get promoted the next day without question. To the other employees, she was nothing more than an opportunist. That morning, work was unbearable. Marta, one of the older janitors, looked at her with a mix of concern and curiosity. "Emily, sweetheart, what's going on?" Emily pretended not to understand. "What are you talking about?" Marta glanced around, making sure no one was nearby before lowering her voice. "They're saying that you're involved with the boss." Emily closed her eyes for a second, feeling a knot tighten in her stomach. "That's ridiculous. So it's not true?" Emily hesitated. She could deny it with everything she had, but the truth was that, in some way, she was involved. Not in the way everyone assumed, but involved enough for her name to be on everyone's lips. "I'm not even going to dignify that with an answer," she said, forcing an indifferent tone. Marta sighed. "Either way, be careful, Emily. People like us, we don't survive this kind of gossip. Emily knew she was right. The day dragged on, and by the time her shift ended, she couldn't wait to get out of that building. But as she turned down the hallway leading to the employee exit, a strange shiver ran down her spine. She slowed her steps. The corridor was empty, but an uneasy feeling crept over her, like she was being watched. Emily gripped the strap of her bag tighter and picked up her pace, pushing through the side exit of the building. The cold New York wind hit her face as she walked toward the subway, and that's when she noticed it. A man, tall, wearing a dark coat, leaning against a streetlight on the other side of the road. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there. But something deep inside her screamed that this wasn't a coincidence. Her heart pounded faster. She looked away and kept walking, trying to ignore the chill creeping up her spine. Maybe she was just being paranoid. Maybe he was just some random guy waiting for someone. But as she stepped into the subway, something inside her whispered that the eyes on her hadn't left. Waiting. And that was when Emily realized she wasn't just involved in Daniel's life anymore. Now she was in the middle of the danger surrounding him. Emily stepped into her apartment, heart still racing. She locked the door quickly, turning the key twice, and leaned against the cold wood. That man. She couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Paranoia or real danger? She closed her eyes for a moment, forcing herself to breathe. Lily was asleep on the small couch, an open storybook still resting beside her. Emily walked over carefully, pulling the blanket up over her tiny body. Her daughter was everything. The only reason she got up every morning. The only reason she faced everything without hesitation. But now something new had crept into her life. Something she had never wanted to bring inside. Fear. In the next day, Emily arrived at work with a decision. She needed to distance herself from Daniel. The whispers in the building hadn't died down. The suspicious stares from employees only reinforced her conviction. Whatever this was, it had to end. The problem was, it wasn't that simple. A few hours into her shift, Charlotte, Daniel's personal secretary, appeared in front of her, impeccable and serious, as always. "Mr. Sterling wants to see you in his office." Emily felt her stomach tighten. "Now?" Charlotte simply nodded. Emily took a deep breath and stepped into the elevator, feeling every floor rise like she was walking straight into the inevitable. She had to tell him that this had to stop. When the office door closed behind her, Daniel was standing by the massive window, staring out at the city skyline. His gray suit was perfectly in place, but his face, something was different. Tiredness? Worry? What happened? She asked, crossing her arms. He turned slowly, his dark eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made her hold her breath. "You were followed last night." Emily felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. "What?" Daniel ran a hand through his hair, a sign of contained frustration. "I had your security reinforced after I noticed you were being watched. One of my men saw the guy on the street, following you." A chill ran down her spine. "You have men watching me? I was making sure you were safe, Emily." Without telling me, Daniel stepped closer, his expression dark. "I knew you'd tell me not to worry, but guess what? Now you have to worry." Her chest tightened. It wasn't paranoia. She really was in the middle of something bigger than she could control. "I can't be part of this, Daniel," she whispered, her voice lower than she intended. "You already are." Her eyes flashed with confusion and anger. "I'm a janitor, Daniel. I don't belong in your world. I shouldn't be in danger because of you." He stared at her for a long moment, his dark gaze like the night itself. Then, his voice came out low, rough, filled with something deeper. "I know, and that's why I'm doing everything I can to keep you and your daughter safe." Emily swallowed hard. "You care about me?" Daniel didn't hesitate. Yes, that single word made something inside her crumble. Emily felt her walls crack, her fears waver. She wanted to believe him, She wanted to trust him. But could she? Could she risk her heart? Could she accept that, as impossible as it seemed, Daniel Sterling truly felt something for her? Because in that instant, staring at him, Emily realized something terrifying. She felt the same. Emily never imagined her life could change so drastically, so quickly. In a matter of days, she had gone from being just a janitor to someone who, somehow, was caught up in the dangerous game of a billionaire. And now she was being watched. Daniel's revelation about the man who had followed her the night before shook her. Someone was after her? Why? Fear clawed at her chest, but she tried to push it down. No, this couldn't be real. But that night, everything fell apart. Emily was heading home, just like she did every day. The subway station was emptier than usual, a strange silence hanging in the air. She pulled her coat tighter, feeling anxiety creep up her spine. Then, a black car pulled up beside her. Before she could react, two strong hands grabbed her, yanking her into the vehicle. She tried to scream, but a rough hand clamped over her mouth, silencing her. Her heart pounded violently. This was it. Pure fear rushed through her like a shockwave. She couldn't disappear. She couldn't leave Lily alone. The voices around her were muffled, distorted, but she caught one of the men saying, "The boss sent a message to Sterling. Daniel, they were doing this because of him." The car sped through the streets of New York. Emily was being taken away to an unknown fate. Her body trembled, panic choking her thoughts. She squeezed her eyes shut, forcing herself to think. Think, Emily. Think. She took a deep breath. If she stayed still, she was accepting her fate. But if she fought, there had to be a chance. She waited, the perfect moment. When the man beside her loosened his grip on her arms, she thrust her knee upward, hard, into his stomach. He let out a loud curse, doubling over, just enough time for Emily to reach for the door handle. The car was still moving, but Emily didn't think twice. She jumped. The impact with the asphalt was brutal. Her body rolled across the street, pain exploding through her arms and legs. But she was alive. She pushed herself up, stumbling, and ran, without looking back. Tires screeched against the pavement as the car slammed to a stop. She heard the men shouting, but she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. She turned a corner and sprinted down the avenue, the streetlights blurring in her vision. She needed to find a phone. She needed to call him. When Daniel answered, his voice was tight with tension. "Emily? They tried to take me." Her voice trembled. I got away, but I think they're still after me." Silence. Then his voice turned sharp as a blade. "Where are you?" She looked around, trying to get her bearings. "Near 5 Tage Avenue, an alley. Stay where you are. I'm coming." Emily hung up and leaned against the cold wall, trying to catch her breath. Her body ached, but fear kept her alert. Minutes later, a black car appeared at the end of the street. Daniel was out of it before the driver even stopped completely. He found her against the wall, struggling to breathe. His eyes widened at the sight of her, bruised, disheveled, terrified. "Emily!" He closed the distance between them in seconds, his hands gently cupping her face. "Are you hurt?" She tried to smile, but it took effort. "I think I survived." Daniel shut his eyes for a second, as if trying to control the fury and fear raging inside him. "I promised I would protect you. It wasn't your fault." He stared at her, his jaw tight. "They did this to get to me." Emily saw it then. He was blaming himself. You can't take responsibility for everything. But he ignored her attempt to ease the situation and wrapped an arm around her, guiding her to the car. Once inside, Daniel grabbed his phone and made a quick call. "I want to know who's behind this." Now, Emily watched him, and in that moment, something inside her shifted. He wasn't just a billionaire. He wasn't just the man she had found wounded and disoriented. Daniel cared about her, and that realization made her heart falter in a way she wasn't ready to admit. But deep down, She knew nothing between them would ever be the same again. Emily never imagined she would one day need to be protected by a billionaire, let alone that her life would be turned upside down in a matter of days. But here she was, sitting on the luxurious sofa of Daniel Sterling's penthouse, wrapped in a soft blanket, while he spoke on the phone, his voice dripping with authority and controlled fury. "I want every name, every call, every trace these bastards left behind." Daniel paced the room, his steps sharp and deliberate. "And when we find out who's behind this, I want this threat eliminated for good." Emily wrapped her arms around herself, trying to steady her trembling body. It wasn't just the shock. It was the new reality closing in on her. The fear hadn't completely left her, but something inside whispered that as long as she was with him, she was safe. When Daniel finally hung up, his dark eyes locked onto hers. "You need to stay here until we handle this." She frowned. "Here? In your apartment?" "Yes." His tone left no room for argument. "I won't risk them finding you again. Daniel, I have a daughter. I can't just disappear." He took a deep breath, as if he had already anticipated that response. "Lily will be safe. We'll reinforce security around her and your home. But I need you to trust me, Emily." She fell silent for a moment, trying to process everything. Trusting someone had never been easy for her. She had always been on her own, had always learned that depending on others only led to disappointment. But Daniel was here, fighting for her, risking himself for her. "Why are you doing this?" Her voice came out low, almost a whisper. He knelt in front of her, taking her hands firmly in his. "Because you changed my life." Emily held her breath. "Daniel, since that night, when you found me in that alley, something inside me changed. You didn't know who I was. You didn't expect anything from me. But you helped me anyway. And now, no matter what happens, I won't let anything happen to you." Her eyes burned with unshed tears. How long had it been since someone truly cared about her? Since someone looked at her and saw more than just a woman struggling to survive? "I don't know how to handle this," she admitted. Daniel's thumb brushed gently over the back of her hand. "Then let me handle it for both of us." Emily closed her eyes for a moment, trying to suppress the flood of emotions rushing through her chest. But when she opened them, she found the only answer that truly mattered. She wasn't alone. Not anymore. The days that followed, Daniel kept his promise. The investigation revealed that the kidnapping attempt had been orchestrated by a former board member of the company, a man involved in the corruption schemes, someone who wanted Daniel out of the way before he could fully expose them. But they failed. With the evidence gathered, Daniel took them all down. The company's name was cleared, and those who tried to destroy him paid the price. And Emily? She expected that, after everything, Daniel would just move on with his life. That he would go back to being the untouchable billionaire he had always been. But he didn't go anywhere. He stayed by her side. Months later, Emily's life had changed completely. Not because Daniel had offered her a better position, which she had initially refused, but later accepted on her own terms with pride, but because, for the first time in years, she had allowed herself to be happy. Daniel became a part of her life, a part of Lily's life, and despite their different worlds, they had found a way to make it work. One quiet evening, as they walked through Central Park, Daniel took her hand, his eyes locking onto hers with the same intensity as the first time. "I promise to protect you," he said, "but I never expected you to become the one thing I want to protect forever." Emily smiled, feeling her heart lighter than it had been in years. She had never wanted a fairy tale, but somehow fate wrote one for her. If you enjoyed this video, let us know in the comments. Your opinion is very important to us. Don't forget to subscribe. A big hug, and see you in the next video.